Salutations everybody, it is Matty here today, sitting down for my review of Dead Space Remake. A big thank you to EA for providing the review code a couple of days ahead of launch for me to play through the entire game. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't get to talk about it often, and when I do, it flops, but I love the Dead Space duology. It's some of my favorite in all of gaming. What third game? It doesn't exist. I don't know what you're talking about. Behind role-playing games, survival horror is easily my favorite genre. I just don't get to talk about it a lot because it's quite frankly irrelevant to my content that I put out here. But there's nothing better than the intensity of managing resources while being chased down by some of the most horrifying creatures. And I feel like none do it better than the original Dead Space. So imagine my sheer terror as I hear that EA, following the gutting of Visceral Games, is actually going to now remake the original Dead Space, my favorite survival horror game of all time, thanks to the success of Resident Evil 2 Remake, where I'm like, oh god, they're money motivated, they're taking one of my favorite games of all time, and they're gonna remake it with EA Motive. Now, EA Motive is behind the pretty solid Star Wars Squadrons, the campaign of Star Wars Battlefront, and we now know they're working on an Iron Man game. So to me, this was a prove it moment. How much could you keep this remake pure, improve it possibly in the right ways, and prove me wrong? Because at the end of the day, I was someone who said for a long while, why are we remaking this? I've replayed this game so many times, as recently as just last year, and I was thinking to myself, this doesn't need a remake. So was I wrong? I'll let you know right now, yeah. They did a phenomenal job here, EA Motive. If I could lift my foot and put it in my mouth, I absolutely would, because my word, hats off to you. You've done it, and you've done a fantastic job, and now I want you to go and try Dead Space 2 even, another favorite of mine, and make a third one, right? Because the third doesn't exist. There's no third game. Now, what makes the original Dead Space special is its lack of HUD, the incredible audio capturing Isaac's descent into madness, the dismemberment-focused gameplay, and the Ishimura itself as you crawl through this iron temple that holds all sorts of surprises within it, yet it feels totally believable. That's what captures the original Dead Space and why it's so special. What I aim to answer here is not what makes this game work so well in its original state, but what's new here in the remake, and why I love it so much. It arguably is now the definitive version of Dead Space. EA Motive has done a phenomenal job at keeping their hands off of the most important parts of the game while putting subtle but yet vital improvements into every other pocket of this game, making it an absolute treat to go through and feeling way more fresh and way more new than I ever truly expected. So ladies and gentlemen, if you are new here and you're into day one reviews, you're in the right place. Consider subscribing. Now, let's talk about everything new in Dead Space Remake. Man, oh man, this circuit breaker mechanic I think is a game changer. So when you go into locations that you may or may not be familiar with, one of the options that's now presented to you is, let's say for example, you need to turn on an elevator. To turn on an elevator, you either have to sacrifice the oxygen in the room or the lights. When you can the lights, suddenly there's a new fear factor put into this game. And my oh my, this game has some of the best use of lighting and particle effects that I have seen in a game, as it brings it to a whole new level. It gives it tension far beyond the original, especially this lighting. The use of darkness even, and how necromorphs kind of crawl out of nowhere. It's truly terrifying. I've replayed Dead Space so many times, and now the fear factor is gone. For me to actually be jumping and going like, oh, and like running away and getting nervous, I was so enthused to experience that fear once again. And really, it's because of these technical changes where they can have the same layout in the same levels that you know and love, but because of the darkness and the flickering lights, when they're coming at you, and they're coming at you a little bit quicker now, it's like, oh god, it feels so real. But it's not just the lighting and particle effects. It goes down to the little things. There are more environmental details for you to appreciate, to absorb the world that the Ishimura is within. There's even blood now on Isaac's suit right off the get-go. This is just a fun detail that captures the bloody, visceral nature, pardon the pun, of Dead Space. And yes, even the stomp scream here is back, and it gets more intense as you get deeper into the game. It's such a small detail, but right when I fired up the game, I went, let's hear what Gunnar Wright's stomp sounds are in Dead Space Remake all these years later. And at first I was like, doesn't give me that Dead Space 2 like, yeah, like that you're really looking for. Horrible imitation, by the way. But as I got deeper in the game and I started stomping away, you start to get like the F-bombs as he's stomping more and more, and he starts really letting it out. It captures again that descent into madness, and it's that beautiful audio-based attention to detail that made Dead Space 1 a true game changer at the time. It wasn't that it was just a phenomenal survival horror game, it got all the very little minuscule details just right, and that's one of them. Another major change here is full control during zero gravity sections. Now, not only are these much better, because previously in Dead Space, you would have to Superman jump from one end of the room to the other, but now here in Remake, you can just fly around the room as you would in Dead Space 2. This leads to fun combat encounters, such as enemies diving at you, and you'll hear necromorphs crawling around this area. And again, this is where the lighting becomes a little bit more impactful as you're searching high and low for this enemy, and suddenly they dive past you to the other end of the room. That type of stuff goes such a long way. But there's also changes to things like puzzles. For example, when you're activating the Ishimura's defense cannons, it's a whole entirely new segment. It's not a drastic overhaul of it, but it's much more enjoyable, and it makes use of the brand new mechanic. It's something that I look at the original and go, okay, this type of stuff is better than the original, undeniably so. Perhaps the only gripe I have, if you will, is Isaac's face. Isaac got the, I call it Spider-Man remaster treatment. Remember, we had Spider-Man PS4. I thought that face was perfect. Then the PS5 remaster drops and they're like, yeah, this kind of Walmart Tom Holland, how about him? It's like, what happened? Why did we do this? I still don't get it. So they kind of took that same energy here with Dead Space. I think Isaac's face was perfect in the originals, and they gave him this clean cut look with auburn hair. And as someone with auburn hair, I'm just like, what? Like, what are we doing here? Why does he look like this? But fortunately, the man is masked most of the time, and it's not really coming off that often, so it's not that big of a deal. And if anything, a nitpick, it's not going to ruin the game, but I just had to vent that out because I've been holding that in for a while. Otherwise, yes, as I'm sure you could tell, he's voiced now. This was something I was worried about because I thought it would come with a bulk of story changes. One of the things I liked, but admittedly was critical of with the original Dead Space, is that Isaac is barked orders at constantly. Having a now voiced Isaac Clarke by, yes, his original VA, Gunnar Wright, goes a long way in making it feel like a collaborative effort between Kendra, Hammond, and Isaac, rather than, Isaac, I need you to do this, and he just stands there silently and does so. It was certainly a compromise when this game first came out in 2008. It felt natural when he was voiced in Dead Space 2. I just wondered how it would compromise the actual story because Isaac's silence, I felt, again, captured that descent into madness. Fortunately, because he's voiced, it does not mean he's chatty, and in fact what it manages to do is bring more narrative elements to the forefront that are typically buried. These are things like the unitologist, the effects of the marker. Typically these were hidden away in audio and text logs, and there's still a lot of stuff that you can consume, and many of them have also changed, but Isaac talking about it and making it a more central narrative element, and even sometimes talking about his parents, I thought humanized him, made him more interesting, and also helped the story out, because I always thought the story in Dead Space 1 was phenomenal. That subtle descent, I'm going to keep talking about that subtle descent into madness and what's really going on in the Ishimura, that mystery and how it all comes together is fantastic. So I was very much of the purist mindset, like, please don't change this. And I'm pleased to say that outside of a couple of things here, the story hasn't changed at all. For example, Kendra, typically a very much standoffish character, she's way more compassionate in this game. I kind of like this because as someone going into the remake, you know what to expect of these characters, and when they're changed up, you kind of feel a little off balance. And I'm happy it was the good type of off balance that something like Final Fantasy VII Remake provided us, where when Final Fantasy VII Remake pulled around, they made Avalanche a much more relevant group of characters, making Jesse one of the best characters in the game. It was in that moment you went, aha, I never would have thought that this was important, but I'm glad they did this. Same thing here. Kendra and Hammond are way better characters this time around. Are they going to blow your socks off with phenomenal performances and big character stories? Probably not, but they are much more interesting, complex characters, showing more emotion and showing their own personal struggles as they're aboard the Ishimura. I appreciate that a lot because, again, it starts to pull that nature of just barking orders at Isaac out of the game in exchange for something a little more like, we need to survive. This is really tough. How can we do this together? There are also some new crewmates aboard the Kellion when you start the game. As I mentioned earlier, there are some changes to audio logs that really focus on, say, the unitologist and the marker. They've always been there, but there are some adjustments there as well. But otherwise, the story itself is intact and the same. Again, something I was afraid they would tamper with heavily. Now, that doesn't mean that they aren't planning other changes. When I rolled credits on the game, it did say that there is a new Game Plus option available and that there are more mysteries awaiting you. So I have not gone all the way into New Game Plus, which I do plan to do, but this could mean there's something hidden in there that I'm currently unaware of. I did just play the base game, if you will, through all the way and did a lot of exploring and all that stuff, but I did not get to do a full New Game Plus option, so I don't know what new things may lie in that route. And yes, there are even more changes. You thought I'd be done. There are so many, and perhaps it's more apparent to me because I've played this game so many times, but there are little things like, for example, stomping was just an attack in Dead Space 1 or to crush some of the boxes that were nearby. But in Dead Space 2, they made it more of a loot mechanic. When you stomped enemies, they would pop out ammo, credits, what have you. And now it is like that in Dead Space 1. Something that when I did return to Dead Space 1 multiple times, I go, man, I wish they had that, because that's when the stomp truly became iconic with the scream, with the looting. It was just a moment in gaming. It had to be there. Now you can experience it in Dead Space 1. Again, the stomp was always there. You could get certain pieces of loot with it, but now it's through killing the necromorphs too and getting the rest of the ammo out of their guts, I guess, and it's awesome. Another significant change for those who are returning to the series is the tram itself. So originally in Dead Space, the Xbox 360 PS3 game, what would happen is at the end of chapters, you would board the tram. It would bring you to a new section of the game. This was obviously to account for load times, bringing in different missions, etc., and creating this sense of you're taking the tram to different parts of the Ishimura. What happens now is it's much more interconnected, and the tram itself is no longer necessary to bring you from chapter to chapter. So in fact, what's going to happen instead is there's going to be points where you're going from, in my case, like chapter 1 to 2 or 2 to 3. I'm like, this is totally different in how they introduce it, but I loved how they did it because it didn't dramatically shake it up, but it felt a lot more cohesive. It didn't feel as jarring, like, okay, I guess I got to go board the tram. It worked extremely well. So what this means is the Ishimura is now more interconnected. It's an explorable ship that you can even backtrack throughout and find unique loot waiting for you, because there are things called security clearances. These security clearances pretty much say, like, okay, you have security clearance 3, you can now unlock these chests that have a orange 3 next to them, you can unlock these doors that have an orange 3 next to them, and so on and so forth, and waiting for you are important resources. Now, this is more vital because at first, at the start of this game, I was thinking, oh boy, I wonder why this is so easy, because they gave me so much ammo. As the game carried on medium difficulty, I found that I was running out of resources and I needed to scour the ship and get what I could. Now, the game does expect you to make use of things like kinesis, stasis, all that stuff. It's a game about utilizing all the tools around you. But this exploration is not mandatory. You could, for example, go to the store and spend your credits there and you could get all your ammo through that. But if you want to save those credits for things that I like to do, which are nodes and weapon upgrades, the latter we'll talk about in a moment, I like to go back and explore. It's not entirely mandatory, but it was awesome to suddenly have this almost Metroidvania element added to the game. Because of the tram as well, this means that side quests are in the game. Now, don't get it twisted. You're not going to have suddenly a loaded up journal in this game. There is a side quest that involves Nicole, for example, toward the start of the game, and it lets you connect with her a little bit more. I like this because it's sort of off the beaten path. You might even find yourself stumbling into it at times, which I did. Typically, I didn't have the quest tracker activated for Nicole's quest line, but I would just find it anyway through sheer natural exploration. What's important about this is all you knew in the original Dead Space was Isaac loves Nicole and he's just looking for her here. And that's the main reason he's here, because he hasn't heard from her in a while. But now you get to see her, what she was doing aboard the Ishimura, her importance aboard it, what they were looking into involving the necromorphs, etc., etc. And this quest brings you a little bit closer to that. I like that they made it optional, because for purists, they're going to be like, nah, I'm okay. For me, I think it added a layer to that relationship and understanding her importance beyond just being Isaac's beloved. That's it. So I think it was a great addition to the game, but don't think suddenly you're going to be like, Isaac, if you can get me 5 of these cans, I can make this for you. It's none of that. It's very sparingly used, like extremely sparingly. And that's probably tough to do when they had so much opportunity here with brand new mechanics, but I'm happy they went this way. Less is more in Dead Space 1 Remake, and that is certainly the case here with the side quests. Now, I mentioned earlier changes to weapons. So this comes in the form of, say, alt fires. For example, the pulse rifle's secondary fire is now the proximity mine, so you can actually lay these on the ground. It's kind of similar to Dead Space 2's alternate fire for the pulse rifle, where you would fire off a grenade launcher. You can kind of use it similarly here. Originally in Dead Space 1, Isaac would take a knee and shoot a bunch of lasers into the air. It would look cool, but it was totally useless. And so now you have something more useful here. And there are various changes throughout other weapons that I won't spoil for you, but that's just one example. Otherwise, a lot of them function the same, and that's okay. But I will just say that one of my favorite additions to the game is the changes to weapon upgrades. So as per usual in Dead Space, you're going to get nodes, and you're going to attach these nodes to weapons that you'll be able to increase the reload speed on, the damage on, the rate of fire on, etc., etc. But through looting, exploring, as well as buying from the storefront, you can get weapon upgrades that unlock a new node that's like Special 1, Special 2. And for example, one of the nodes for the plasma cutter does a fire damage over time on enemies. Some are as simple as increase the rate of fire. Some are as simple as the additional ricochet for the Ripper, which by the way is incredible in this game. I absolutely loved using it. It does add that extra layer of progression here without completely dismantling the gameplay balancing. Overall, it's fantastic, and I think it just adds that new game plus drive, like, oh, I want to get all the upgrades. And you're going to need them. Like I said, it's more difficult, no doubt. There's a great new game plus option in there with seemingly more enemies and mysteries, so I'm curious how that's going to go. But ladies and gentlemen, that is everything new in Dead Space Remake. Otherwise, everything you loved from the original is retained. The level design is still fantastic. It does keep some of its hiccups, for example, like during the hydroponics section where you're injecting the enzymes into all of the Weezers. Yeah, I found that a little bit more long-winded, and I wouldn't have hated it if they said, let's trim this down to 5 of them instead. But I love this game, the way it plays, the story, the characters, all of it's so fascinating. And again, just hats off to EA Motive. They did something fantastic here. They convinced me, someone who thinks Dead Space 1 was perfect as is, and with back compat, there was no need to remake it, and made me say, okay, I see why you remade it, and it was worth it. They absolutely killed it here, and while they have Iron Man lined up, I honestly gotta say, I hope this isn't the end of their run with remakes, because I say this in all seriousness, what the ultimate goal is a Dead Space 3 remake, because if anything in the entire trilogy I felt needed a remake, it was that game, right? So I would love to see them try their hand at 2, which was one of the most expensive games ever made, and get to Dead Space 3 Remake. That would be incredible. But what they've done here is proved me entirely wrong. They have proven me wrong and said, this game did deserve a remake, and here's why. And I think it's 100% worth your money. Dead Space 1 isn't going to run up the hour clock. It's about a 9 to 12-hour game, depending on how fresh you are to things, how difficult it is for you, how slow you go through your exploring. That's up to you. But compared to Dead Space 1, which typically took me like 6-ish hours now because I've played it so many times, it did bump up the hour clock a lot. You can get more time out of it by achievement hunting and doing New Game Plus and seeing all the new secrets it has, and that's something I would recommend. But to me, while this may not be bang for your buck in the terms of game time, this is time well spent, and that is equally important here. So Dead Space to me is a day one purchase. EA actually has a great game here, even after what's happened with Visceral. I'm not saying it's justified, but I'm happy that Dead Space is going to see the light of day again and that they did it right. So shout out to EA Motive, shout out to EA. Great job here. Hopefully you continue supporting Dead Space, putting it out to the masses again, and having that competition with Resident Evil that really was a great time for survival horror fans. Especially, well, I shouldn't even say that because I think Resident Evil was doing like 5 and 6 at the time, but I digress. Ladies and gentlemen, that is my review for Dead Space Remake. Let me know your thoughts on the game in the comments down below. I'm so excited to hear your thoughts. Other than that, be sure to follow me on Twitter, follow me on Instagram. Those links are in the description down below. And a big thank you to all the patrons, all the members who continue to support the hell out of the content here. Stay sexy, stay active. I love you all. Peace.